I think peaceful coexistence between the two Koreas is certainly possible and even likely for the foreseeable future. The two Koreas have kept the peace with few exceptions for the last 70 years, even without a formal end to the Korean War. And even though there's never been a peace treaty, the conditions that brought about the Korean War largely no longer exist. North Korea is not significantly more powerful militarily than South Korea, even if they do possess a larger army and nuclear weapons. The South has other significant advantages in terms of logistics and a vibrant economy. Also, the United States has not left South Korea in a vulnerable position as they did in 1949. And finally, North Korea's allies are not currently interested in supporting a North Korean effort at reuniting the Korean Peninsula. Remember that Kim Il sung would not have been able to invade Korea without the support of Joseph Stalin and Mao Zedong. And one of Stalin's primary motives for agreeing to support Kim Il sung was the hope that he could entangle American forces in Korea, thinking that this would strengthen the Soviet position in Europe. In a similar way, Mao supported Kim Il sung, thinking that a war in Korea and Chinese fighting in it would strengthen the communist revolution at home in China. Now, Russia is only a minor ally of North Korea, and Chinese grand strategy seems to be much more focused on Southeast Asia and the island chain than on revisionism in Northeast Asia. Also, the ROK and the US lack any desire for a forcible reunification, and North Korea lacks the ability to execute a forcible reunification, even if they claim that a forcible unification is still desirable. In this sense, I see a peace treaty that would formally end the Korean War as potentially more harmful than beneficial, as it would chip away at the stability I have just described and at the rationale for American forces being stationed on the Korean Peninsula. At the same time, a formal end to the Korean War would not require any changes to the nature and structure of the North Korean regime. A formal end to the Korean War would potentially be more destabilizing than it would be stabilizing. While I think that peaceful coexistence on the Korean Peninsula and in Northeast Asia is the most likely scenario for the foreseeable future, I think there are also reasons to be concerned, to be gravely concerned. We often like to say in English that North Korea is homicidal, not suicidal. Homicidal, not suicidal. Meaning that even though they possess nuclear weapons, and even though they are very bellicose, they are unlikely to ever use them because they understand that if they did, it would be the end of their regime, that it would be suicide for Kim Jong un or his successors to ever use their nuclear weapons. And I think that this is accurate analysis. But I think we should keep in mind that homicidal states, or homicidal individuals for that matter, do not make good neighbors. They are not the kind of people you would like to deal with or live next to. A North Korean state controlled by the Kim dictatorship or inheriting that structure, which makes it unaccountable to the North Korean people and not responsible for their well-being, will always pose a threat to the stability of the Korean Peninsula and Northeast Asia. The emerging rivalry between the United States and China also poses a threat to the Korean Peninsula, as it is more likely that the two Koreas could be drawn into a Sino-American conflict on opposite sides. I don't think at this point that is a likely scenario, but it is certainly a possible one, and it gets more possible the more tensions between the United States and China escalate. Finally, I think the election to be held in the United States in just a matter of days will tell both Koreans and Americans a great deal about the future direction of American foreign policy and what effect it might have on the Korean Peninsula and Northeast Asia. If the nationalist populism represented by Donald Trump is victorious, there will be further obstacles ahead for the US-Korean and the US-Japanese relationship, and possibly, quite possibly, the beginning of an American withdrawal from Northeast Asia. And this could have a host of undesirable effects on the Korean Peninsula for decades to come. I don't think that this is a likely scenario, but it is a possible scenario, and it is cause for some concern. If Donald Trump's populism is defeated, not just at the presidential level, but also at the congressional level, I think these alliances will fare much better. Though the danger of the Korean Peninsula being caught in a conflict between the US and China is still very real. Finally, and I understand this is contentious, but I believe the prospects for peace in Northeast Asia and the long-term interests of the Korean people are much better served by cultivating deep ties with Japan and the Japanese people. Japan is a society that is much more similar to South Korea in terms of values, economic structure, and political norms than is either China or North Korea. A strong alliance between Korea and Japan would not only be beneficial to the United States, but could likely persist to the benefit of both countries long after the United States departs from the region, which will happen. The United States will perhaps stay in Asia for a very long time, perhaps 500 years, but it will depart sooner or later. Nobody knows when, but it will happen, and it's best to think in a very long term if you're looking at trying to maintain the peace and stability of Northeast Asia. Treaties are powerful symbols of the intentions of two peoples or nations when they are ratified via a democratic process and are expressions of shared interests and values. When these two factors are absent, however, treaties are really just scraps of paper and are not worth very much. And I think the American relationship with the Korean Peninsula offers an excellent example of both the strengths and the weaknesses of international treaties. As you all know, and as I discussed in my talk, the US failed to come to the aid of the Kingdom of Chosun in 1905, despite having a treaty with that kingdom. In 1905, the values and interests of the United States and the Kingdom of Chosun did not align, and American leaders did not have a second thought about violating the provisions of that treaty. On the other hand, in 1950, the values and interests of the US and the ROK were not perfectly in line, but there was enough overlap that American leaders felt compelled to intervene when North Korea attacked South Korea, despite not being obligated by any treaty whatsoever to do so. In 1905, the US and Korea had a treaty which proved to not be very valuable. In 1950, there was no treaty, there was no obligation, yet the United States intervened anyway. Since the Korean War, the US and the ROK have had a very strong alliance, as symbolized in the 1953 Mutual Defense Treaty. But it's important to understand this treaty was made after the Korean War to make official a commitment that had already been made. The Mutual Defense Pact of 1953 was in fact written in blood before it was ever written in ink. The strength of the 1953 Mutual Defense Treaty lies not in the paper it was written on or on its legal framework, but in the shared values and interests between the American and the Korean people. I would say values and interests that have only gotten stronger since 1953. Now, someday these values and interests will diverge, And I believe at that time, neither the Korean people nor the American people will have any second thought about abandoning this treaty. I don't think that is imminent, but I think it will happen. Treaties are always temporary. It is the collective will and shared interests that lie at their foundation that either make them strong or make them very weak. And this is why I'm skeptical of a formal treaty ending the Korean War. I am skeptical that a genuine desire for peace is the North Korean motivation for such a treaty. After all, the Koreas have essentially been at peace for nearly 70 years. I am also dubious that North Korea wants such a deal to divert resources from its defense to its national economy for the purposes of development. If North Korea was interested in its own development, there are countless decisions that they could take right now without having any such treaty. North Korea has only 700 kilometers of paved roads in the entire country. North Korea could invest in basic infrastructure that would spur incredible economic development just by promoting the flow of goods and services in their country. And they could do so right now without any such treaty or any formal end to the Korean War. A treaty between the ROK and North Korea ending the war, or between the US and North Korea ending the war, would not be the result of a democratic process on both sides, nor would it be an expression of shared interests and values. And I think such a treaty would not be durable. I also think that ethics and morals are largely absent from international treaties, but also that international relations is not solely about power. I think shared values plays a similar role at the international level that ethics and morals play at the individual level. If American interests were defined narrowly, the US would abandon Taiwan and cease any association with the Tibetan government in exile and the Dalai Lama. It is the perceived sense of shared values with Taiwanese about political freedom and with Tibetans about religious freedom that make these relationships valuable to the United States and valued by the American people, despite the friction that they cause in US-China relations. The US-China relationship, by any objective standard, is much more valuable and important than the US relationship with Taiwan or Tibet. But the American people are hesitant to abandon these relationships because of the sense of shared values. If it was all about power, it would have been done years ago. So I don't see ethics and morals as playing a powerful role in international treaties now or in the future. But I do see shared values as being very important. And finally, I want to make just a few comments on the 1882 treaty since I talked about it in my talk. I want to make sure that I am very clear that the 1882 treaty was not an alliance between the United States and the Kingdom of Chosun. It was not the same as the 1953 Mutual Defense Treaty. The 1882 treaty merely established diplomatic relations between the two countries. The US had no obligation to defend Korea under this treaty. However, the United States did have an obligation to offer American good offices in the event that Korea got into a dispute with a third party. But it's very understand what good offices meant. Good offices is a technical legal term in Western jurisprudence, which means the offer of mediation. So if you have a treaty where you are obligated to offer good offices like the United States had with Korea, and Korea asks for American good offices to be extended, the United States is under an obligation to do so. But that obligation is only considered binding if both parties agree to accept the good offices or mediation. So in the case of Korea and Japan, if the United States would have abided by the strict interpretation of the treaty and extended its good offices to mediate the dispute between Korea and Japan, When the Japanese refused to offer or refused to accept the mediation, as they would have done, the United States' obligations under that treaty would have been terminated and would not have prevented the colonization of Korea. This is a very important point. Theodore Roosevelt technically violated the terms of the treaty by refusing to extend his good offices between Korea and Japan. But even had he done so, I believe it would have made no difference on the subsequent history. It would have made no difference on the Japanese colonization of Korea. They would have continued as they had already planned to do. It would have caused some minor embarrassment for the Japanese to reject Roosevelt's offer. And it would have caused Roosevelt some embarrassment to have his offer rejected. But I do not believe the colonization of Korea would have changed in any sense. The chief importance of the 1882 Korean-American Treaty then was it handed Syngman Rhee and other Koreans an effective means of mobilizing American Christians to support Korean independence. In that sense, this treaty was much more valuable broken than it would have been had the US honored its commitments.